Welcome to a kinda weird case. The Enermax MarbleShell MS31 is a really weird one. On one hand, it's obviously a budget case, like the colors of the plastic front and main metal parts they're just obviously off. But on the other hand, we have sidewise mounted fans, USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, and enough space to work with 38mm thick 420 AIOs. The best way to put it for me is this is a case that tries to aim outside its class. The thing is just scoring and trying are two very different things. But let's start at the beginning. The MarbleShell MS31 exists in two different colors, white and black. And standing on the table, we get ourselves a pretty compact mid-tower, 455mm deep to 14mm wide and 490mm high. On the left side, we got a 2.5mm thick tempered glass side panel, openable using hinges and pulling on this little thing. And yes, it is kept in place using magnets, and they are definitely not the strongest magnets I have ever seen, if I can get this to open, but they will do. This is very much alright. But let's get to the MarbleShell part. The front of the case is covered by a plastic cover with enough holes that you couldn't force me to count them, and the whole thing is pretty thick. Not that this is a good or bad thing, it just means that there is quite the distance between the fans and the front of the case. But this is still a budget case, hence the cover is mounted using the old and very enjoyable plastic clips. Yeah, I hope they never go away. Behind this, we get an additional magnetic dust filter, cause the holes in the front panel will never keep the dust away. And once everything is mounted and installed, the fans will partially shine through the holes and you will see all the light that you have paid for. Ignoring the white Enermax logo in the top left corner, the front is pretty air pass-through-y. We did a build in here, and it's not like this is a very restrictive case, or this particular build is not air restricted by the front. I can remove the front panel and nothing will change, literally nothing. But I believe this is also partially thanks to there being so much space in between the front panel and the actual fans. Thanks to that, you can achieve kind of a buffer zone, which seems to be enough for the build that we did here, but if you would glue the fans to the holes, I really doubt that this would be sufficient. Apparently, the design of the front and these notches is supposed to resemble a marble shell. Okay, if you ask me, this looks more like a turtle shell, but who am I to judge? But let's forget for a second about the marble versus turtle thing and concentrate on what you can actually do inside of this thing. Motherboard-wise, we have pretty much no restrictions. By default, you can mount everything from mini ITX all the way up to regular ATX. However, if you plan to go even higher than that, eATX is possible. You can use the additional holes and mount even those types of behemoths in here, but at a cost. Unlike cases that don't have these holes, if you were to install an M80X board in here, you will lose the cable holes. Nonetheless, they are right next to the ATX motherboard standard, right next to where an ATX motherboard will end. But in this particular case, you can use what is left over of those fan holes to route all the cables to the back of your case, and that's neat. For GPUs, we are pretty well equipped. We are looking at up to 380mm long cords, until you start hitting the front fans, and sidewise we got about 170mm in depth, so the octopus should fit for most cards, but a 90-degree adapter will always be the better choice. There is one thing that I find to be very slightly restrictive, and that's air cooling. We got about 162mm for CPU air coolers, which is fine for most cases, most use cases, I guess. But once you get into dual tower scenarios where you have two 140mm fans, things can get a bit stuffed, especially if that thing is not asymmetrical and you need to lift up one of the fans. On the other hand, Enermax definitely marketed this case as a water cooling case. Even on the feature set, they mentioned that you can stuff this thing with a 38mm thick 420 radiator, which definitely isn't an obvious reference to their own and recently released AIO. Not at all. But back to cooling. In the fan and water cooling department, Enermax did a very fine job. We got a triple 120 or 140 fan mount in the front, which is pre-filled with three 120mm ARGB fans. We got a regular and pre-filled 120mm spot in the back, three 120s or two 140s in the top, and another two potential 120s on the bottom or on top of the PSU shroud. But don't get too happy about those. Not only is the, let's say, breathable area on top of the shroud already kinda small or too small for 120s, but below there isn't anything where the air could really come from, except for the minimal amount of air that would be pushed underneath the whole shroud from the most bottom front fan. So yeah, limited in its capabilities by default. But the part that made me wonder so much about this case are these side mounts. The back panel of the case, which by the way is mounted using non-catching screws, kinda annoying. Anyway, there are holes in there with a magnetic dust filter, and by mounting fans on there you can create a sidewise intake or exhaust, which on paper is very fine. And actually this isn't a feature that you will find on most budget cases. This is usually reserved for the higher segment or Montech, because they just like to do random stuff. However, in the beginning I said that the MarbleShell is kind of a weird mix between budget and not so budget, and the sidewise intake is a perfect example of this. By default, you should be able to mount two 120mm fans in there. However, you can't, because the three front fans are installed on the inside of the case, and therefore you will be left with about 22.5mm. Yeah, that won't really cut it for your 25mm fans. I tried, no chance, you will break whatever fan you try to squeeze in there. What you can do, however, is uninstall the front fans, install the side ones, and then reinstall the front fans. Yes, you will still end up with 22.5mm, and yes, you will bend the backplate slightly to get everything in. Essentially, you're forcing the case to give you the space that you are missing. But in this scenario, you're not coming in at an angle. Like when I try to install the fans, because it's slightly indented, you are coming at an angle and you will break anything you try to push in there. But if you remove the front, install the side, and then reinstall the front, it's coming at 90 degrees and it won't break. And by the way, if you want to mount fans on there, you will be forced to reconnect all of the front fans anyway. By default, they are routed through there, so get ready to unclusterfuck everything that they have done by default. But what you can also do is move the fans from the front fans from inside the case into the front panel, which, as stated before, is thick enough to account for that, and move everybody can breathe freely. This also perfectly illustrates my concerns about this being a budget case that plays outside of its league. Side intakes, definitely upper class, but the default mounting position of the front fans doesn't allow any fan to get mounted there. Issue. Move the fans inside the front panel. Different issue, because now you got a really small air pocket like in between the front panel and the front fans, which might end up creating a whistle noise depending on the fan that you are using, because you are essentially gluing a fan onto a mesh structure, and yeah, that creates all sorts of noise. Yeah, it's just never perfect, and for myself, I would rather use the method with all of the fans being inside of the case, even if that would force me, or forced me because I did it, to press the back panel a bit towards the back. I know it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel good, but I believe this is like the best way of doing things. But let's get to the annoying part. The case is heavily marketed as usable with a 420mm, 38mm thick AIO in the front, which is true. All of that will fit in there, even without mounting the fans onto or into the front panel. But it will render the side fans completely useless. Yeah, 38mm worth of rad plus 25mm worth of fan, and we covered essentially 63mm of the side intake, which is almost precisely half of the fan. So we made half the fans useless. Or in the very least, we made the whole airflow concept complicated as hell, and we introduced a ton of turbulences. If the case was 10mm longer, none of this would have been a talking point. In the end, for me, it just seems like the case is heavily limited by Enermax's decision to try and make everything as compact as possible. Yes, they achieved a very compact case, which can still house a 420, still house a M80X motherboard essentially, but it came at the cost of really stupid decisions that you will need to make at some point. And in the end, it's just solving one problem with another problem with another problem with another problem, and just make it slightly bigger. Anyway, the top is very easy, triple 120 or dual 140, and kudos to Enermax for leaving so much space in the front. This makes cable management a lot easier and allows 38mm rads to be used without a hassle. Another slightly interesting setup would be a 420mm red on the side, as long as you move the fans in the front outside of the case, so inside the front panel. Cooling is kind of a weird topic in here. But let's finish the specs with the easier parts. The power supply sits in its own compartment in the bottom, and it can be potentially up to 220mm long, but I wouldn't really go above the 190 to keep enough space in front of it for cabling. But if that isn't enough, you are free to remove the hard drive cage behind, giving us do whatever you'd want type of space. Speaking of which, using that thing, we can mount two drives, either 2.5 inch or 3.5 inch, one on top and one inside. And behind the motherboard area, we got another two 2.5 inch drive spots. All of which sounds very fine for the form factor. 4 drive spots, 2 of which can be 3.5 inch, seems fine for the size. The I/O also is very fine for the size and budget. We got two USB 3.0, a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, which was surprising for this price, a combined audio in and out, and a relatively clicky start button and a restart button. The cable management, that's a mixed bag here. We got pretty big and well distributed cable holes all around the case, with only the new GPU one missing, and the cutouts next to the motherboard have that rubber sleeve going around for protection and hiding unwanted stuff, so that's really nice. But the 2mm worth of space in the back, that's just very much low end. And it is like really tight, especially once you get into custom cables or cable extensions. But on the other hand, I gotta say the back panel absorbs like any type of you did too much particularly well. Everything is mounted with a big, let's say, hinge in the front, and then you just shove the back towards the case and you screw it down. And considering the cable mess that I have created in this build, I am really impressed that there isn't like a huge bulge in the back. Everything sits flat. Any other case would have ended up in like a U shape, but not this one. The back absorbed everything fantastically. The included Velcro ties and zip tie slots definitely help, but it's just not going to be a very enjoyable process if you use any sort of extension. Just don't use extensions. But what is enjoyable is the GPU anti-sag bracket. Included in the bag of goodies, you will get this little thing. It's magnetic. You can place it wherever you want on top of the PSU shroud, and then you can turn the top, making it higher and higher until you reach your GPU. With a rubber on the top and bottom, not to scratch anything. Really cool. A nice to have thing, but it is definitely not a movable option. If your PC is just standing there, sure, it will do its job very fine, but that thing is not meant to transport your PC. That thing will not hold on to anything. If you wiggle it enough, it will just fall. So don't. Now, one very positive thing I wanted to keep until the very end is the included fan situation. They are all 3-pin ARGB controllable, which you do or you do not like, that's up to you, but they are surprisingly good. Not like Nokia, Fantex, or even some Cooler Master fans good, but as far as like free fans go, they are absolutely like above average for free fans. Up until 60-70%, I wouldn't really notice them, and at max 1800 RPM, sure, they are a bit louder than like your Nokia NF812, but they are still surprisingly okay. All of them are pre-connected using splitters. All 4 are 4-pin PWM controllable, so just connect the ARGB and PWM to your motherboard and off you go. And to be honest, I wouldn't even replace them. Like if I would do a build in this thing that I would sell or use, I would just keep them. They are fine. For the average, like mid build, they are absolutely okay. So all in all, it's a very weird one. It's like a good case. Don't get me wrong. Looking at the whole spectrum, I would still consider this to be a good case considering its placement. It has a few twists that I just don't get, the whole fan situation in the front I don't really get, but things like the side intake, that's really cool to have, but considering it would look hideous if they are left empty, you are basically forced to fill them. And doing so only makes sense if you move the front fans outside of the case, or you will do very harmful stuff to your fans. And if you're even thinking about installing a rad in the front, including the 420, which was advertised heavily everywhere, you will make the side fans basically useless, or will make them more useless the more you add to that red. But on the other hand, we need to give Enermax that this is probably the smallest case I have ever had on the table that actually supports 420 and especially thick 420s. So there is that. The whole thing is just a mix of budget versus high-end, like the bad color matching, which is kinda bad. The kinda small feet, which are just like slightly over 2 centimeters high. They could have been a bit higher and thicker for a better stand. And on the other hand, we got things like 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, and we got this the side intakes, and it's like jumping between the two worlds all the time. But the price does explain it a lot. I can get one of those right here and now for 67 euros, which is a very good price. If you take into account that you will get 4 perfectly fine fans, not amazing fans, but they are perfectly fine for the job. They are ARGB, they are 4-pin controllable, you have 420 support with 38mm thick radiators, and all of that for below 70 bucks. And that, in my opinion, does make it absolutely fine. For below 70 bucks to get this package, I would be ready to refiddle all of the fans or all the front fans outside of the case. I would do it, no doubt. So all in all, for the price point, it's absolutely fine. And considering the few attempts to implement higher end features on a lower price segment case, Enermax did a fine job with the turtle shell, in my opinion. The one thing I didn't have in mind when I did the build, and I sweared a lot, is my expectations towards the price weren't consistent. I didn't know the price at the point, now I know the price, so I have adjusted my expectations, and that's really a thing that you need to keep in mind with any type of budget case. You need to have your expectations aligned with the price. And for the price, the feature set is really fine, with features from the higher up segment, not bad at all. And as long as you don't expect the experience of a 150 euro high-end case with a case of 70 bucks, then everything is exactly as it should be. But okay, this should be all for the Enermax MarbleShell MS31, and at this point a huge thank you to Enermax for sending it over. Oh, on a side note, we have a Discord server, so if you want to join, the link is down below. And we got channel membership, so if you are planning to sell your soul for an RG poop emoji, that's one way to go. But if not, I'm also releasing the content to all members 2 or 3 weeks in advance. Except for the NDA stuff, because, you know, I don't want to get sued. Additionally, you can rest assured that the income will not only keep the channel afloat, but will also serve to get a turtle. Not that I want one, but I want to compare the front panel to a turtle shell, because I want to see if I'm right. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you want to continue, have a look at our take on the new Enermax AIO. It may not have such a cool name, but it's still an interesting product. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.